From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
Thank you very much. G'day, good evening. Welcome to a special Tuesday night edition of the program. It's not particularly special because it's a Tuesday, but it just felt like a nice thing to say. Welcome to the show. There's a lot to get to. I promise you, crackerjack debate. Looking forward to it with James Morrow and with Joe Hildebrand. But first, the day's news. Now, it looks like the Prime Minister is going to break another election promise. This time, it's about elections.
The federal election is due in May 2025. I think that our terms are too short with just 3 years.
His actual position is that there should be 4-year terms, but we start to learn that his plan of don't worry about an election this year, there'll be one in 2025, may not be the case. In fact, Albo's going to do exactly what every other first-term Prime Minister does, which is to call an early election. We know this because it's the form of anyone who's ever been a first-term government. Secondly, Tim Gartrell, this bloke, who is the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister, well, he was sending a message around to staff about a new person being hired in the office, and some eagle eyes. First amongst them was Samantha Maiden at news.com.au, where she noticed this line. This is an important role as we enter the election year. Meaning we are in 2024 and this is the election year. Now, again, there's no grand surprise that there will be an early election. John Howard had an early election, of course, in relation to the GST. There was an early election after Kevin Rudd was rolled by Julia Gillard. There will be an early election in this case because the Prime Minister thinks that he's going to be able to get a bigger result than what he got at the last election. But what is the big idea that we're going to be debating? Who knows? It's not going to be something as big as a GST. But if that is the case, then we've got to start watching lots of other signs about a potential early election. Number one, are they going to put limits on the amount of money that can be spent by candidates at an election? If this is the case, that's good for anyone who's trying to fight people like the Teals. You see, the Teals have been able to spend huge amounts of money, but the reality is that they will be put back in their box, and potentially that will mean that the Teals will not be able to be as successful as they were at the last election. However, those rules may not end up kicking in because they need a Teal in the Senate to get anything passed. So the way they're planning to buy him off is to increase the number of senators for the Northern Territory and the ACT. That will effectively lower the threshold for how many votes you need to get into the Senate. Now, if you look at a place like the Northern Territory, it's generally 50-50. But if they go from 2 to 4 senators, then we could be in a scenario where maybe a Green, maybe an extra CLP, or you end up in a scenario where it ends up as 2 Labor, 1 CLP and 1 Green, but ultimately a net gain for the centre-left. When you look at the ACT, where it is 1 Labor, Katie Gallagher, and 1 Teal, that is David Pocock, well, there would be very little chance of the Libs being able to get any of the 4 places on offer. So again, you might end up in a scenario where it's 1 Labor, 2 Teals and 1 Green, meaning, again, the total number of lefties in the Senate will increase. Now, if we talk about the likelihood of what is to happen at a federal election, I think any honest person, regardless of what you want to happen in an election, would see that this is really a battle between Labor being able to have a majority or go into minority. Now, if they go into minority, which I think at this stage is the most likely because they'd lose seats in Western Australia, they'll potentially lose seats in Western Sydney and also in Queensland. Now, if that happens, well, then they're going to have to go to the crossbench to go shopping for support to form a government. Now, they desperately want to avoid repeating the mistakes of 2010, where we had to sit there and put up with Oakeshott and Windsor, but really it was the Greens who ended up introducing things like the carbon tax. So the Prime Minister would be hoping that if Labor goes into minority, it doesn't go deep into minority. They've probably got about a chance of falling to, say, 72 seats. Now, that is 4 short of a majority. But They would be able to have Andrew Wilkie, Rebecca Sharkey, I would presume a couple of the lefty teals, particularly out of Melbourne, and that would be able to deliver them supply, so they would say, we're not in any relationship with the Greens, despite the fact that the Greens, of course, are the only reason anything will get passed in the Senate. Now, if this was a text slip-up, OK. But every likelihood and every expectation is that there will be an election this year. So when? The Parliament cannot go to an election before August, but I would think it's going to be pretty soon after there. Because firstly, that's when the too little too late tax cuts actually start to appear in people's bank accounts, but who's going to want to reward the government for just $14 or $15 a week? We'll see. I also believe that the government is probably going to put back the $1,500 that they took off you at the last election, in part because of what we have been talking about and how it affects 10 million people. Now, if they're able to get an extra $1,500 as an automatic tax return, when would people start accessing that? Well, around August, after they have filled out the paperwork that would have come into effect on the 1st of July. So, with no knowledge, apart from this text message and a bloke who's been around a few times, we are probably going to head to an early election. The stakes are not about whether Albo remains the Prime Minister, but most likely whether he goes from the majority government of just a couple of seats to a minority government. And if you're somebody who wishes poorly upon the Prime Minister, you hope that he goes deep in a minority government. But the numbers, the way they probably are, means that he can afford to go down by about 4 seats south of the majority and still end up relatively comfortable. But a week is a long time in politics, and who knows what's going to happen when it comes to months and months. But we always follow the data here. Now, as you know, the first weekend in March is when there is going to be a by-election. This is, of course, referred to as a do-or-die by-election, but the reality is that it is in and around the area of Frankston. Now, the reason for it is because of the passing of the former Labor MP. Now, that helps Labor, firstly because they've got a bit of a margin, but secondly because the reason that they are having the by-election. They're not having it because of scandal. Instead, they are doing it because of a tragedy of the local MP losing. That said, this is working class Australia. This is the Australia that is going to realise the too little too late tax cut is too little too late. These are the people who have been squeezed within an inch of their financial life when it comes to paying off home loans. So the preposition from the Liberal Party is that the bloke that you just saw on screen is a good shot of going pretty damn close. He's the local mayor in Frankston, and by all accounts, he is pretty popular. Now, again, the expectations game is always fascinating here, where we know people like nasty Nikki Savva are out there saying, if Dutton doesn't win this thing and win this thing by 100, then his leadership's over, hand in your gun and badge. But as I just explained, things are in the Labor Party's favour, except for the things that you would assume are actually going to be enough to change people's votes. So we've got something special to announce here this evening, which is we are going to go to Dunkley, and we want to meet the people who will be voting in this election. You know how we do the pub test? Yes, this is when we turn up and we get people who are members of the community to ask questions of some key candidates. And here's how it works. First in, best dressed. I want you to be the first in before the parties and the activists all start to work it out. But whoever is the first to register will be the people that will be in the hall that night. Now, it's happening next Monday night. You'll see it here live on Sky News. We'll also do the normal editorial, have a little panel discussion around it. But the Dunkley pub test is there if you would like to join us. Please send an email to pubtest@skynews.com.au, and you can also tell us what's the question you would like to ask the candidates. For obvious reasons, the invitation is made to the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, plus we'll find some room for other people on the ballot, but not everyone on the ballot. We only have so much time and so many questions to go through. But if you would like to join us for the pub test in Dunkley next Monday, so this Monday coming up, please, pubtest@skynews.com.au. Now, presumably, one of the biggest issues in that by-election that will come up during the pub test, and certainly something that we have been relentless in our focus because it's real life, that it is financially difficult in Australia right now due to cost of living. Now, yes, the overall inflation data may tell us that it is kind of where it was and the best it's been for a couple of years, but we're still way above where it was a few years ago. And we have shown you story after story of people who are truly being affected by cost of living. But guess what? Apparently all of it, cost of living crisis is a complete invention. It's an invention by me, by Sky News Primetime, by our parent company. Quite a conspiracy theory that is being floated by the far left wings of the internet, that the Murdoch media is in overdrive creating a cost of living problem. Really? We're the ones that are creating the cost of living problem for the Prime Minister. Pull the other one, it plays jingle bells. Apparently we created 3.7 million Australian households who last year had trouble putting food on the table. Apparently we created Foodbank's logic for this problem, being the rising cost in living, being the reason why Australians are struggling to put food on the table. Now, apparently, we invented the people who have been queuing for food. We invented the people who turned around and told a Senate Estimates Committee, a cost of living committee, that they take ice from charities so they can keep their food cold and melt the ice down so they have water to drink. Apparently, we invented how much your insurance went up. Apparently, I made up how much your power bills have increased. And as you just saw, as late as today, we have been able to convince Channel 9 to report on the number of Australians that are relying upon their credit cards, that are going into deeper debt to pay for essentials. A survey by the organisation Good 360 is what I want to quote for you now. It supplies unsold essential goods to charities. It has found that the crisis is being felt most sharply in South Australia and in Queensland, where 34% and 30% of people, respectively, say they are doing it tougher now than before. Amid the straining household budgets, 1 in 6 people are depending on credit to pay for everyday expenses. I don't know, but according to the kooks on the far left who think that there is nothing to see here, the cost of living crisis was all when the Liberals were in charge. It's all way worse since Labor came to power. All of those interest rate rises, all an invention of the media that they don't like. Seriously. Again, apparently we invented 109,000 people who lost their full-time job in December. Apparently we invented 80,000 people joining the unemployment queues in January. And also we have invented the financial circumstances that lead to, among others, Deloitte Access Economics talking about who is most likely to lose their job in the next little while. In fact, the figures which have been published by Deloitte predicted that jobs growth in industries such as construction, retail, hospitality, manufacturing and mining will suffer the most as employers look to right-size their workforces in subdued economic conditions. So cost of living, which is a problem, which is a reality, a problem that the government has sought to recognise with a too little too late tax cut of $15 for the poorest taxpayers amongst us. But it's all an invention of me, this station and our parent company. What absolute garbage. Now, of course, there are plenty of people who like to act as the PR firm of the Prime Minister inside the Australian media, but, as we told you last night, this one has to take the cake, doesn't it? Where the bloke from the West Australian newspaper gets the Prime Minister to sign his arm to promise there will be no change to the GST in Western Australia. The only problem is, this bloke, yes, while being a reporter for the West Australian newspaper, until last year, he worked for the Albanese government. He worked for Patrick Gorman, and he is able to do what he wants, but then the idea that he has been employed to report on politics and to write a story about his own stunt is kind of a new low. But there it was, front page of the West Australian. Labor Prime Minister signs former Labor staffer turned journalist's hand in a stunt that was for the advantage of the Prime Minister. Now remember, we were supposedly to believe a few nights ago that the Prime Minister couldn't possibly be briefed on whether an illegal boat turned up in Australia, because you see, I was in the car and, I was in the car as if his phone doesn't work, but he had a texter to, pull out of his pocket to sign the arm of the former Labor staffer who was essentially running a PR firm in terms of an opportunity there, metaphorically, for the Prime Minister. Well, the thing is, the spin continues. Now, firstly, the fact that the Prime Minister thinks the people of Western Australia are that stupid, I think he's going to get a little rude awakening, as, fingers crossed, Roger Cook will at their state elections soon. But we know that there has been problems with border protection since this government came to power. Now, by the way, the next time any of them tell you, any of them even try to tell you that Operation Sovereign Borders is exactly the same as the system that was there under the previous government, well, firstly, that's garbage. All right? Sovereign Borders is three things: boat turnbacks, offshore processing, and the third, and the kind of really important one, is temporary protection visas, meaning the people who eventually, even if they bleed their way into the community, will never be able to permanently stay. But this government turned around and said 19,000 people who were left over from the last time Labor was in power, well, they're now on their way towards permanent citizenship. So Operation Sovereign Borders ain't what it used to be. And the claim from Peter Dutton is that it ain't what it used to be when it comes to dollars either.
If you look at the budget papers, which is what we're looking at from the last budget, there is a cumulative impact of $600 million being taken out of Border Force.
Now, those are the numbers. He quotes it from the budget, but clueless Claire O'Neill, of course, trying to play the only game that this government thinks they need to get re-elected, following on from the way the Democrats play politics in the United States. And as we have shown you, the Prime Minister has a dirt unit, and the entire focus after the losing of the voice and the wasting of $450 million at a referendum was to get Dutton. All else fails, blame Dutton. And that's exactly what clueless Claire O'Neill did when the budget failures are there for anyone to read.
This is an operation that Australians should be proud of. It is very effective at policing our borders. We will continue to adjust our approach, of course, because the people smugglers continue to adjust their approach. What we do not need is politicians running around the country, as Peter Dutton has done, telling outright lies.
These people are unbelievable, right? So if the funding thing was a lie, could somebody please explain to me why extra money has just been found for Australian Border Force? Why the government is now out there and touting, we definitely didn't cut anything, but here's a couple of $100 million extra. Now, again, Peter Dutton knows his stuff on border protection. He, Scott Morrison and the late, great Jim Molan, they set up the system that Labor now is slowly but surely simultaneously using and undermining by giving that permanent citizenship to a football stadium of people who arrived here illegally by boat, who were ruled not to be refugees, who slowly but surely were taken off offshore processing and bled back into the community. Now, again, Peter Dutton knows what he's talking about. Clueless Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles, I don't trust them. You don't trust them either. Because these are the people who simultaneously were telling us that when it came to the High Court decision to release people from detention, like the people who are some of the worst amongst the community, that they assumed they were going to win in the High Court while they were being briefed that you probably wouldn't. These were the people who said, we care about national security while releasing these people without visas. These were the people who say that it's the opposition that's the problem when they're the ones that couldn't put the ankle bracelets on. These are the people who said, let's rush the laws through Parliament, but then won't use the laws to apply for a single person to go back into detention. So they can blame Dutton as much as they like and they'll be clapped on by The Guardian, the ABC and all the usual haters. But the reality of people in Australia when it comes to border security, they know who's on their side, and it ain't the current mob. Now, about Chris Bowen and his big car ban. This is coming in the next couple of years' time, and I'm pleased to say huge reaction to this. It is, yes, the war on utes, the attempt for the people at the front end of the plane to tell the people at the back end of the plane what they must drive, despite the fact that twice as many utes were being sold as the number 1 and number 2 sold cars in the country than the number 3 or number 4. Chris Bowen says, there's no ban on these things, but of course he's putting a system in place that means no one will be able to sell them. I'm not banning them. We're just squeezing people till eventually they have to ban themselves. Well, today, again, the auto industry is out there telling us the reality, that even if they are somehow able to sell things like a Toyota Hilux or to be able to get a Ford Ranger out there, it's going to cost a lot of money.
If the car you buy doesn't meet the government's new standard, puts the price of a car up quite dramatically. The biggest selling car last year was the Ranger, and one of those versions, the Ranger, $6,000 more in the first year. Mazda CX-5, for instance, you're looking at $4,000 next year, going up to almost $13,000 by 2029.
What would that guy know? He only sells cars. He only is the interface between the car company and the car you want to buy. Chris Bowen is the idiot, as we told you last night, who's been in Parliament since 2004 and has not had to buy his own car for 20 years. These people all pretend they're in it for the worker, but they're really in it for the big end of town, the front end of the plane and the dinner parties where they all can pat themselves on the back. Because Australia must do something about 1% of global emissions when China, which currently is 30% of global emissions, can continue to pollute. Double their pollution every day until 2030. And by that time, well, Australians are apparently all putting around in Jetsons hover cars by then. Fair dinkum, these people, they are ridiculous. Meantime, housing industry turning around and saying, if you're going to make it more expensive for a tradie to have a car, then guess what is going to happen? The cost of the tradie coming to your building site is going to become more expensive. And just in case you haven't had enough of the government telling us what to do, what about this from the Australian today? The federal government is now going to tell us about what the climate change impacts are on the food that we eat. The federal government's official advice on diets will now incorporate the impact of certain foods on climate change, sparking outrage from farmers who fear that it's driven by an ideological agenda against red meat. Look, if you want to chew kale till your heart's content, good luck. If you want to have red meat, good luck to you. Again, I repeat, Australia, 1% of the world's problem. China, 30%. Throw in the third world, throw in Russia, India, it's like 2/3. When they fix up, we'll fix up. As we told you last night, the vast majority of people in regional Queensland do not feel safe in their homes for the most obvious of reasons, which is crime. Youth crime that is particularly out of control. Survey yesterday in the Courier Mail says that 56.3% of people in regional Queensland do not feel safe in their home or in the community. So we learned today that the Police Commissioner in Queensland is not going to put her hand up for a contract to be renewed. I think that technically means she's been fired, but still, here she is quitting.
I don't feel like a scapegoat. I would love to have had the conversation with the Minister in my time, which is fine. I just brought that back. Brought it forward, but I purposely brought it forward so that we could move on.
If she doesn't feel like a scapegoat, guess what? You are a scapegoat. Why? Because just last week, literally just last week, the Police Commissioner was being used by the Miles government as a person who was briefing state cabinet on the plans on how to take on youth crime. But of course, what is, in my view, absolutely offensive here, and I'm glad if this is not the right person to be policing the state, then get them out of the way. But the police are not the problem. If the government wants to get fair income, it's not the police commissioner or the sergeants or the constables or anyone else in charge. It's the people who they appoint to the judiciary. It is the laws that might have very high maximums but no minimums. Until you change the laws that are currently not being policed but being adjudicated on, and you are tying the hands of the people who would otherwise let them off, then the Miles government is, well, again, useless on this particular issue. Now, it's been a couple of days since this took place, but there's a bloke called Navalny. He's now passed away, and the assumption is that he has met with foul play. He is, of course, the Russian opposition leader. Now, there is a fascinating documentary. I'm sure you can find it somewhere on the Foxtel platform, but please go and find this. It is a sensational documentary about a bloke who was completely safe, completely okay, but decided to go back to Russia to try to confront Vladimir Putin. For his sins, he ended up in a jail. And that jail was located in the Arctic Circle. He, of course, later ended up dying, and the suggestions from his family is that he had bruises on his body. Now, amazingly, Navalny actually taped, as part of that documentary, a message to be played around the world upon his death. I gladly do so now.
Здесь у меня просто очевидная вещь. Ну, не сдавайтесь. Не надо, нельзя сдаваться. Если это произошло, это означает, что мы необыкновенно сильны в этот момент, раз они решили меня убить. Ну и нужно использовать эту силу. Не сдаваться. Помнить о том, что мы огромная сила, которая находится под гнетом вот этих вот чуваков плохих, лишь потому что мы не можем осознать, насколько действительно мы сильны. Все, что нужно для торжества зла, это бездействие добрых людей.
Yevgeny Navalny, I wish him nothing but peace now, and I certainly hope that his family becomes safe. But this is a horrible situation. Very obvious what Putin and the Russians have done. But what about Joe Biden? Now, clearly, Russian opposition leader detained by Putin's people in the lead up to a Russian election, put into a prison in the Arctic Circle. He dies and has bruises. So who do you think that, Biden would blame for it all? Or the media would blame for it as well? Oh, yeah, Donald Trump.
You suggesting there could be a link between what Donald Trump was saying Russia, do whatever the hell you want, tornado allies.
I think it's quite a coincidence. And certainly Russia is listening to what the former president is saying. He's saying crazy stuff.
They're making a big mistake not responding. Look, the way they're walking away from the threat of Russia, the way they're walking away from NATO, the way they're walking away from meeting our obligations, it's just shocking. I've been for a while. I've never seen anything like this.
It's just defensive. Now, Donald Trump can be responsible for lots of things and not responsible for lots of others, but the idea that he is responsible for what Putin's goons did to the opposition leader in Russia is madness. And again, an example about how the far left, and that is the way that it works with most on the establishment left now, are willing to do to a political opponent. Ridiculous. All right, quick break. Back with more. Looking forward to discussing this. James Morrow, his fingers are on the pulse. What does he think about an early election? Joe Hildebrand, has he spoken to Albo yet? Thanks for watching us this Tuesday night. You're watching Paul Murray Live. Glad you're doing it. Thanks for watching. Now, if you'd like to join us in Frankston, in Dunkley, this Monday, coming up, because people get lost in the this Monday, next Monday business. Monday, coming up, we will be there if you would like to join us for the pub test on the 26th of February. All you got to do is send me an email, pubtest@skynews.com.au. We have invited all of the major candidates to be there. We will find out whether the protection rackets of the major parties continues. But we will have all the spots there for people. And the whole idea is this. It's not about what I want to ask. It's about what you want to ask. And if you are somebody in that area, and obviously if somebody sends me an email wanting to come from Brisbane and just yell, you're not going to get in the room, right? We want locals, the first in, best dressed, okay? So we've mentioned it a couple of times tonight so that the word doesn't get out on social media and randomly 400 Greens turn up one afternoon. All right, so that's next Monday. Pub test, really looking forward to it. Two blokes that I'm sure will be taking notes on it is none other than the wonderful James Morrow and delightful. You can
find me in the pub any Monday night.
Correct, Joe Hildebrand. So, okay, let's play Canberra Bubble Game just for a moment here,
right,
where we are going to overinterpret a text message which has been leaked. But still, it is the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister making reference to somebody who has just been appointed in the Prime Minister's office and refers to this election year. Now, somebody could technically say, well, hang on, 12 months from now, in early February, still the year. Okay, the idea is, are we going to have it this year or next year? Now, the likelihood, I think, of this year is more probable. Why? Because every first-term government does this. Every first-term government goes early. It's not about bashing Albo for once on this. They all go early. But you've got to go early for a big idea.
Yep,
I'm not entirely sure what the big idea is that we'd be going early for here, but I kind of yes-no off the start here. Do we agree that the most likely outcome of an election this year is Labor majority versus minority? We're not talking about a change of government. this early? What do you reckon, James?
I think there's a few interesting things out of that story you're referring to there. The number one thing, I agree, they are going to go to an early election. I don't know what the big idea it's going to be, but we're going to start to see that pitched up off of the back of the budget. We're going to see a lot of stuff in the May budget. You know that it's going to be all about fairness and this sort of stuff, which really means we're going to pick your pocket for being too successful, and I'm going to, pit you against you for being, this or that, and it's really the envy and class warfare card. The other interesting thing, though, about that text message, that was to announce a new principal private secretary in the PM's office. And before that even story broke, I was hearing a lot of chatter out of Canberra. The people in the Prime Minister's office were not happy about this appointment. So I suspect that within the walls of the Prime Minister's office, there are going to be quite a few kind of internecine factional fights brewing, which is going to make this year, if nothing else, really entertaining.
Yeah, fun. I mean, look, again, whatever group text message this was on, Labor's very good at holding its own, keeping it all rather quiet. For someone somewhere to be getting it about, well, means something will be plugged quickly. But let's talk about if there was an election this year. Now, again, Prime Minister will pull whatever he wants out of the hat in the next little while. But my supposition right now is the Teals being the bloc they are means even if the Libs win a few, they're not going to wipe out the Teals to get to 76. So therefore, we're talking about minorities here. And I mentioned in chapter and verse in the editorial about just how big the margin is. Are Labor people worried about the potential of minority government, or they think they can manage it so well?
Certainly some are. A mate of mine in the right, one of the very, I was going to say very few, that's unkind, but a really smart head who, the last time Labor was in government, amid the Rudd-Gillard fiasco, he was one of those really cool heads in the room who saw what was unplaying, was mortified, and we catch up from time to time, and he says, he told me that minority was probably the best we could hope for. He using the word we, not me. I'm an impartial and fair and balanced journalist.
Yeah.
And
you're certainly more impartial than the bloke who used to be the Labor staffer who's writing about politics. So here's my phone didn't work when the country had a boat turn up, but here's the texter for the stunt with the former Labor staffer with the West Australian.
Having said that, a very senior source in the government is very bullish about. I mean, in the election, as to when it will be held when they think they can win it. And while I suppose a lot of people think that a lot of the glosses come off the government, and yes, it lost a lot of skin with the Voice, and that was really bruising, but we forget, I think, that the government's popularity, things like the Aston by-election, right, which it won by a country mile when it should have lost it. That came after a really small primary vote for Labor at the election, and when Labor was only able to get up because of these weird sort of seats in WA coming through, and it didn't get a lot of votes. So when you're actually looking at the electoral map for next time around, if Labor has got the primary vote that it's got now, it's actually going up. Labor is riding higher in the water than it actually was at the election when it was still an unknown quantity. So it's kind of gone from, down here to up here, and then it's sort of come halfway down the hill again. Everyone's saying, it's going to go backwards. In fact, it's still up.
If it's still above where they were at the last election.
That's right.
But that said, we're talking about things they currently hold by a B's being able to have slightly better margins, but there's not a whole series of tight margin seats on the other side to take off. And then there's a couple of X factors. And again, we're just having this conversation so you're on the inside of it, so you know what's happening. So when you're at a barbecue, you can say, mate, I've heard this, that and the other. Because a couple of interesting things are going to happen. I think the Greens vote goes up at this election because of their focus on renters.
Housing,
Now, remember, they're at about 14% now. Total renting population in Australia is 30%. That's a rich thing to go. In the same way they did about the environment, I think they're going to do with renters. Secondly, I think there's going to be some local mayors that are going to run against Western Sydney MPs, like that idiot Chris Bowen, who are going to be able to flip it Lee style, and that's going to be a fascinating thing to watch, because I reckon some of these communities, James, have had enough of these Labor boffins.
So, what's really interesting happening with some of these communities in Western Sydney, in fact, communities across the country, the renters thing is fascinating, and this is why, I think the Liberals have to be very careful about backing in density and things like this, because they're just creating big chunks of Labor seats, especially when the unions say, well, we'll build this if we can put 30% of our union members as essential workers
100%.
into these blocks.
Really well thought
But the thing is, too, There's this massive push on that nobody voted for to remake Australia the way we live. And people are really annoyed about it in places like Western Sydney. And they're saying, hang on, you're telling me I've got to move from a house into an apartment? You're telling me I can't have a car? I have to, take the bus? What is this all about? For them, quite rightfully, it's seen as a decline in their standard of living, and it is. And this is what Labor is promising as part of getting to some utopia. And if the Liberals, I think, are clever, they're going to smartly make the big Australia problem a big issue coming up because, the thing is about, and I'll write this in the Daily Telegraph tomorrow, it's like migration's a bit like drinks after work. A few makes you feel good, but, too many and you're in a world of pain. Just ask Barnaby Joyce.
And the government's response is going to be, well, hang on, we've already tinkered with that. It was a lot last year, but next year's going to be lower. Well, hang on, that's like, again, please give me credit for response to the cost of living crisis, for too little, too late tax cuts, and $1,500 we took off you last year because we gave it back to you this year. But about this car thing, right, and Chris Bowen, again, governments love being able to pretend long, complicated name of something, and they're not compelling anything, but the result of it is less of the thing they want to ban. Now, I say if you are opposing this, don't call it the emissions. It's Bowen's ban on big cars, right? It's ute taxes. That's what you have to say, right? Why? I mean, do you think this is a smart policy, this idea?
Well, I mean, obviously, Chris Bowen is a smart man, and he's not going to, despite perhaps the difference of opinion.
Can we vote on that? Can we take a quick vote in the room?
But Chris Bowen is a very, very smart man. He's very intelligent. And,
he knew when to get over the Labor leadership contest, 29 hours.
A lot of people said that him being the caretaker leader while Albo and Shorten fought it out was the best and most stable period in Labor Party history. That's another story. He's clearly doesn't want to sign his political suicide note, does he? So clearly he doesn't think that the impact is going to be as big or as bad as Matt Canavan is saying it's going to be. And obviously Matt, who I love dearly, of course, has a vested interest in presenting the worst case, most apocalyptic...
Until the government puts out the numbers.
This is the thing, which I don't get here. Chris Bowen says, oh no, it's about increasing choice, but it's actually about decreasing choice.
So it's about incentivising electric vehicles, obviously. It's about making electric vehicles more affordable.
And making petrol and diesel more expensive. So it's not about choice.
But this is
it's about restriction of choice.
But I'm saying the margins by which people are buying utes, they are so massive.
I want to get one. I would identify as a future Ford Ranger owner.
And as a card-carrying bogan, at some point I will end up owning some sort of electric vehicle. I get it, right? I get where the future goes, but just let the market take us there. And this idea that, because America's doing it. I'll tell you, I was looking into this, which is, by the way... It's not really the case. It's some states that have legislated it. The Biden administration has just made an executive order, which means a potential Trump administration can reverse it.
Well, there's actually more to this, too. The Biden administration is now signaling through their EPA, through the New York Times and Washington Post, that they're walking back their emissions, their tailpipe reduction scheme, and saying the big push to EVs, that's going to happen after 2030 because... The thing is, I've talked to car dealers about this. I've talked to a lot of people about this. They say, we really kind of thought that the rev up would keep going, but then it's like everybody kind of went who wanted the EVs and they bought them and they got them. Right, and then it's like after that, the rate of uptake starts to slow.
Yeah, I think that the key thing here is that, when governments try to intervene in the market and pick winners and losers, it very rarely works out for the best. And if you get ahead of popular sentiment, like the Cash for Clunkers scheme, for example, or measures with electric vehicles that have come in the past, like we know what Bill Shorten said in the 2019 election and how that was the death of the weekend. And of course, Australia just wasn't ready for it. I think, though, as electric vehicles do become more ubiquitous, that there is a sort of change in attitude. And I think that if the government sees that this is going to cause a massive spike in other cars, they are going to very quickly change whatever they have to do.
I don't think the sentiment changes by July 1. I think, yes, into the future for certain pockets, but for the people that are watching us in the suburbs or the regions, the amount you travel, how you travel, what you want to carry, these are the complexities.
And I think we need to be about some hybrids as well. And I think that is the
as opposed to putting the luxury car tax on, which is what they did.
That's right, which I think is silly. And hybrids are like the gas
It's the transition.
Of the
I'm
electric
with
car
you.
day. We
I'm with
need
you.
hybrids as a transition. It's nowhere near as bad as just petrol only.
Yeah.
It's not quite as good as electric.
So don't put luxury car tax on it. You know these people. Pick up the phone.
It solves your range anxiety problem. It solves your...
Well, but you guys are both being, so cynical and selfish about this. What's in it for me? What am I allowed to drive? And you guys are ignoring the great opportunities for the child cobalt and lithium miners in Africa and other places that are really getting, leg up on their education and their
very good
pocket
point.
money. So, the CV thing, it's great for the kids.
Do it for the kids in the mines.
Yeah, wow.
Do it for the landfill in 20 years' time. Good point.
Yeah.
All right, quick break. Back with more here on Paul Murray Live. Thanks for watching this Tuesday night. If you ever want to send me an email, you can do so. paul@skynews.com.au. Thanks for watching. Check all of the socials as well. Don't forget highlights of the show, skynews.com.au. You can see him on Outsiders, kicking ass each and every Sunday morning. Read him in the Daily Telegraph. And, just see his happy face around the joint whenever you wish. James Morrow. Look at him in the tie and everything. It's very formal. I like this.
I feel slightly underdressed.
Well, whereas Joe Hildebrand,
I also feel like I'm not
animal.
the biggest media tart on the panel. A first for me.
Don't sell yourself short. You're a tremendous tart, as they used to say.
Thank you.
Can we just, for a second, watch how the Channel 9 newspapers have, in the past couple of days, been running big features about why we shouldn't have closed our schools during COVID. Now, we could have the media chat about this, but let's actually have the parent chat about this. That organisation, the people who write for it, were the loudest, tweetingest, screamiest, fear-mongeriest people in and around COVID that led to the absurdity of closing schools. Now, I'm glad that they've joined where we were 4 years ago, but for them to turn around and actually now discover the problem that I believe they helped create. They helped slant the conversation to other the people who, like us, were saying what the evidence was, running against. Remember, the Prime Minister at the time was saying very clearly, don't close schools. And then there was that whole back and forth, Andrew Probyn, and then we were all off into the hilarity of the bloke from the ABC versus the Prime Ministership. This really annoys me, Joe, and I know it annoys both of you.
This is obviously just a fundamental article of faith for me. Those two journos, it should be said, are really good journos, and they're fantastic. They weren't part of that lockdown-lovey culture that emerged elsewhere in the media. But and good on them both for finally pulling the rug back on it. And again, to the Herald's credit, it had an article, and this is what really, really alarmed me. I knew that closing schools was a bad idea. I knew there was no evidence. I was shouting it from the rooftops, as I know others were as well. It was, I think, just after the first lockdown, there was a report in the Sydney Morning Herald that found that, according to the Teachers Federation's own inquiry, this is where the evidence came out, there were more than 3,000 kids in New South Wales public high schools alone, I think it was, who just never came back.
Never went back.
The first lockdown in one school system, in one state, one lockdown, 3,000 gone. Yep. Just disappeared children. Now, any parent who can contemplate, and we all know they're the most vulnerable ones, the most disadvantaged ones who have suffered abuse and neglect at home, they could be on the street. We just don't know where they are. And just imagine the carnage that has come since.
But this is why I wanted a Royal Commission, right? I don't want this sort of cover-up inquiry that's happening where we're not going to talk about this. I want a Royal Commission that, as one of its recommendations says, never close schools.
Paul, first of all, on Scott Morrison, I just don't think he covered himself with glory at all during that pandemic. I'm sorry, frankly. He allowed the states to play against one another. He allowed state borders to be closed. He allowed so much insanity to happen. The most terrible thing, though, that we did is that, we had a pandemic plan, and Tony Abbott had actually updated it when he was health minister. And it was based on the SARS experience in China. And it said you don't close schools. And in April 2020, I wrote a piece for the Daily Telegraph reporting on what The Lancet, which is the most prestigious medical journal out there, said. And they said, don't close schools. And then I looked at the letters page on the Herald today, and it's all like, well, there's no plan for a pandemic. Hindsight is 2020. I was like, no, there actually is something on the shelf, and you can take it down, and it says, in a pandemic, schools, leave them open. There's very little benefit to shutting them. Yeah. And yet they say, well, for them, this was, as you say, it was an article of faith. And this is like, it's something on the progressive side. I was in Parliament House the other day. youth climate kiddies were all over Parliament, and they were all wearing masks. I mean, this is it's just a pathology for these people.
Yeah. No, it is, and it's so incredibly damaging to the credibility of the science that was used as a justification for all these things. Because they were saying, well, we have to follow the science. And what we actually found was that governments were making up reasons. Like, again, the New South Wales government's own analysis, its own study into whether COVID was spreading in schools, found there was no problem. In fact, schools were probably the safest place to be in a COVID outbreak, because the children, God love them, were killing the disease. They were where COVID went to die, and you had these people acting as though children were these dirty little spreaders of the disease. And again, what sort of effed up adult actually thinks of kids that way?
But I don't want to get all this thrown around about our kids.
And again, so it was an absolute lie.
Super spreaders.
We had the Queensland government saying, and Anastasia Palaszczuk, to her credit, as I always say, said, no, we're not going to close schools. Then the Teachers Union in Queensland went and had a little stop work meeting. Suddenly, according to the top medical advice.
And then I don't give her credit that the following year, like 2022, they delayed the return to school.
Right, but public sentiment, and again, we were very much the minority on this, but public sentiment was so fear-driven, and again, parents were pulling their kids out of schools before they were even closed, so there was a panic, and the politicians basically retrofitted the science to suit the panic.
The scientists retrofitted the science to meet the panic, and the politicians, there's another word for them, leaders allowed and played the panic to their own disgraceful ends. Like your pal Anastasia Palaszczuk saying, Queensland hospitals are for Queensland people.
But again, I have to say it again. I think this is one of the things last year that, ran white hot for about 3 days and then people moved on. I would like them not to move on, which is about that need for that Royal Commission, a proper investigation, because we know what's happening now, right? 3-person committee, 2 of the people were pro-lockdown, 1 of them literally was a former Labor staffer. They're not looking into what the states are doing, and I just want this very open process where people who were unable to go and physically see their loved ones get to be able to be heard, and again, clear absolute rulings from an independent third party, not some sort of Clayton's way of saying we had an inquiry. I mean, I've got to say it's painful to watch the thing that's happening in the UK, but literally you could sit there and night after week after month they have this big drawn out thing, and the policy will be the better as a result of it. Thank you, gentlemen. I do appreciate it. We will see you everywhere and everywhere as it should be. Thank you, lads. All right, quick break, back with more. We've got the late debate a couple of minutes from here on Sky News. Just one last reminder about that pub test. We know plenty of people have sent the emails already, but please, if you'd like to join us Monday night in the electorate of Dunkley, if you've got questions for the candidates, invitations have been put out to the major parties. So if they turn up, I hope so. But otherwise, I hope you do, which is pubtest@skynews.com.au, pubtest@skynews.com.au. Now, quickly before we go, now flying back from Townsville after a great time with Our Town on the weekend. And there was a little bit of a delay, fine, fair enough, that's the way that airlines go. But I've got to say, there was this one guy that was sitting not next to me, but one over, so he's 2 down from me. And there's this little delay, a little bit tense, people are a bit, and I noticed that he was sort of playing with his phone a lot. Okay, fair enough. And then for about 15 minutes, he was watching on YouTube trailers for a horror movie called The Pledge. Now, this is a horror movie where basically the streets of LA go completely lawless. The Purge, I think it was. My apologies, not The Pledge. That's another movie. I think that one stars Jack Nicholson. But anyway, this bloke was listening to a horror movie trailer at full volume. No headphones. No headphones whatsoever. This bloke. So if you are watching us, sir, please buy a set of headphones. If not, don't do it, okay? It is not acceptable. I don't understand. Now, of course, I'm not exactly the most courageous bloke because I didn't say it to him then. I'm saying it to you now. Here's the late debate.